Sin diverted creation from God's purposes, and depravity cemented in that brokenness. The kingdom has been preparing for this moment, the invasion that begins in the coming of the King. Jesus is the hinge on which the ages turn. Those ages are the old one, symbolized here in red, a line that goes from original creation, depicted in Genesis 1, all the way to the end of old creation, depicted at the end of the book of Revelation, and new creation, depicted as a green line, whose alpha, or beginning, is in the Annunciation, or the conception of Jesus, the Word made flesh, and which ends in an eternity of never-ending new creation in which all things are reconciled through him. The Bible describes Jesus as the Alpha and the Omega, divine language associating him with the God who is beyond creation and beyond its beginning and ending. Here I'm going to refer to Jesus as the Omega, the end of the old, as well as the Alpha, the beginning of the new, because that is what his ministry accomplishes. Jesus becomes the end of what is old and frustrated, and the beginning of what is new and ultimate. We're used to historical turning points like these. In America, my country, a turning point is the ratification of the Constitution, which ended one era and which began another era. Of course, the new era doesn't begin from scratch. It's a renewing of what was already there and a reorienting and ordering of what needed reorienting. Because the Constitution came about during the Enlightenment, its founders and a lot of people seem to treat it as if it's divorced from history and divorced from a cultural context that actually birthed it, that of the Enlightenment. Other cultures and communities have different turning points. The Exodus is the turning point for Judaism, and the Hijra is the turning point for Islam. And some communities have no such turning point. Paganism, for instance, and animism in remote, unreached people groups. These communities' lives look more situated in Genesis 12, in the situation in which God started something new with Abraham. The substance of Christian faith is what Jesus has done, the so-called work of Christ. Revelation 21:5 sums that up. Behold, he says, I am making all things new. Note the present tense, not I will, not I have, but I am. We stand at what Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 called the ends of the ages, the overlap between the old and the new. That's the red shifting to green bracket in the middle of the screen where we are. We exist after the incarnation, after Jesus has begun a new arrangement, yet before his appearing to put an end forever to creation's oldness. And by the way, it was his coming that made creation old. It's the advent of the new that ages what comes to be called the old. That means that Christian ethics has to bear in mind that we live both on the red line of old creation and on the green line of new and eternal creation. We occupy both spaces, and both spaces are at odds. That's what gives the Christian interim ethic its distinctive flavor compared to the Jewish interim ethic. You find signs of the church's awareness of where it is between the times all over the New Testament. In fact, it forms the basic structure of most of the New Testament writings. Just about every biblical writing has an imperative to it. It's telling us how to behave, how to respond, and how to act. And in just about every New Testament writing, that imperative rests on an indicative, what God has done, which provides the basis for how we should act. A common problem for ethics is said to be the difficulty of getting from is to ought, from how things are to how things ought to be. But that assumes a purposeless reality, which is how the Enlightenment tended to view it. It excluded God's purpose from the creation itself and thought we can just study the creation in isolation. But Jesus' ministry from beginning to end confirms that creation is not a neutral thing. It's a purposeful creation of its creator. Its is reflects its ought. Framing this as a leap from is to ought, from the way things are to the way things ought to be, is actually getting it backwards. It is because it ought to be. It is because God purposes it. And the character of Jesus' work and its outcome in his resurrection and ascension demonstrates that. So Jesus' work carries vast ethical implications for our lives, for our conduct, for the goals and expectations of Christians. So Jesus' work carries vast implications on the lives of Christians, our conduct, our goals, and our expectations. Here's a passage in 2 Corinthians that compresses this really well. It's in 5:14. For the love of Christ controls us, because we've concluded this, that one has died for all. Therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him, who for their sake died and was raised. Do you see the ought here underneath the is? God's purpose is driving the process. 16. From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. According to the flesh means from mere outward appearances, and particularly from an old creation redline point of view. Even though we, that means Paul, once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. The risen Jesus made quite an impression on Paul when he appeared to him on the way to Damascus. 17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, there is new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. All this is from God. What makes Christian ethics distinct and what has made it so powerful when people actually follow it is this awareness that we stand in a unique, different place because of Christ's work, and our conduct follows from that standing. Knowing this shifts not only our comprehension of what the goal is, but also the perspective from which we approach the goal. The work of Christ reveals what is at the apex, the top of Mount Fuji. He also provides the way up Mount Fuji, as well as the perspective that demonstrates that we are in fog in the first place. He is the something greater, greater than Solomon, greater than Jonah, who discloses that obscure framework of his kingdom, which frames everything and reveals the limits of what otherwise we don't know the limits of. Its light reveals our darkness. Its clarity reveals the fog that we're in. And because knowing this reorients us, opens our eyes, sharing this knowledge, sharing the good news of the kingdom, changes the world a little at a time.